Some moments in a courtroom change lives forever, and the strangest part is that nobody in the room realizes it until it's already too late. The air inside courtroom 4B smelled faintly of old wood polish and burnt coffee from the hallway vending machine, the kind of smell that clings to government buildings that have seen 50 years of arguments, verdicts, and quiet defeats. I remember the slow creak of the wooden bench beneath me, the low murmur of attorneys shuffling papers, and the fluorescent lights humming overhead like tired insects. My name is Daniel Harper, and on that morning I thought I was just another husband sitting beside his wife at what should have been a routine hearing about a ridiculous HOA dispute. Across the aisle sat Brenda Whitmore, president of the Redwood Creek Homeowners Association, dressed in a bright cream blazer that probably cost more than my truck payment. She had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind you see on people who believe rules only exist for everyone else. For months, she'd been turning our quiet move into a nightmare of notices, fines, and threats, all because we didn't fit her picture of the right kind of neighbors. That morning she looked completely relaxed, leaning back in her chair like someone already celebrating a victory. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she laughed softly, a sharp little sound that bounced off the courtroom walls. My wife, Emily, sat beside me, calm as always, hands folded neatly on the table. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was just another quiet spouse dragged into legal drama she didn't ask for. That was the assumption Brenda had made from the beginning. The clerk sorted documents at the front desk while the bailiff adjusted a stack of folders. Outside the tall windows, the Texas sun was just climbing over the courthouse parking lot, turning the windshields of pickup trucks into bright flashes of light. The whole place felt ordinary, almost boring, the way courtrooms often do right before something unforgettable happens. Brenda stood suddenly and stepped closer to our table, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Her perfume drifted through the air, sweet and overpowering. She leaned forward just enough for the entire room to hear her voice when she spoke, every word dripping with the kind of confidence people get when they think they're untouchable. People like you, she said, glancing between me and Emily, should really learn how things work in this neighborhood. A few heads turned. The attorneys paused mid-conversation. Even the clerk looked up from her paperwork. Then there was a brief, stunned silence that spread through the courtroom like someone had cut the sound from the room. Brenda stepped back, satisfied with herself, completely unaware that the moment she had just created was about to become the worst mistake of her life. Because 30 seconds later, when the bailiff called for everyone to rise and the courtroom doors closed with a heavy echo, the woman Brenda thought she had just humiliated would calmly walk to the front of the room, turn, and sit down in the judge's chair. I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment in any legal fight is the moment your opponent becomes absolutely certain they have already won. Brenda Whitmore had that look now, the relaxed shoulders, the slow, confident smile, the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed the entire room existed to confirm her version of reality. But to understand why she was standing there acting like the queen of Redwood Creek, you have to go back 6 months to the day Emily and I first drove into that neighborhood. The tires of my pickup rolled slowly over the smooth concrete entrance road while sunlight flashed across identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. Redwood Creek Estates looked exactly like the kind of place real estate agents describe with words like prestigious and well-managed. Fresh-cut grass, wide sidewalks, little American flags on front porches, the faint smell of barbecue drifting through the warm Texas afternoon air. We had just finished a 14-hour drive from Colorado, and I remember Emily laughing softly when we passed the stone sign at the entrance. Welcome to Redwood Creek Estates. The letters were carved deep into the granite, like someone wanted the neighborhood name to last longer than the people who lived there. At the time, it felt like the beginning of a quiet chapter. I worked as a construction attorney specializing in property disputes, which meant I spent most of my days reading contracts and arguing about land boundaries measured in inches. Emily had accepted a new position with the federal court system in Austin, a job she had earned after nearly a decade of long hours, law school loans, and more late-night legal research than any normal human should endure. We bought a modest 2-story house at the edge of the neighborhood, the kind with a narrow driveway and a big oak tree in the front yard that dropped acorns like little wooden marbles every fall. The first week felt peaceful. Neighbors waved politely. Delivery trucks rolled through every afternoon. At night, you could hear crickets humming in the grass and the distant rumble of traffic from the highway 2 miles away. Then we met Brenda Whitmore. I still remember the first time I saw her because she did not walk across the street like a normal neighbor introducing herself. She arrived in a white luxury sport utility vehicle that stopped directly in front of our driveway, like a police traffic stop. The engine idled quietly while the driver door opened, and out stepped Brenda Whitmore in bright tennis shoes and a perfectly pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched over the pocket. She carried a clipboard under one arm and a measuring tape in the other hand. Some people carry themselves like community volunteers. Brenda carried herself like a building inspector who had already decided something was wrong. She gave us a smile that looked rehearsed and said in a voice that sounded pleasant, but somehow hollow, that she was the president of the Redwood Creek Homeowners Association, and she just wanted to welcome us to the neighborhood. The moment she said the word president, I felt the same quiet warning I get when a contract clause looks a little too complicated for a simple agreement. Emily thanked her politely. Brenda's eyes moved slowly across the front yard, the mailbox, the driveway, the fence line, like a surveyor mapping out potential violations. I remember the soft metallic click when she extended the measuring tape and checked the distance between our mailbox and the curb. That was the first moment I realized that Redwood Creek was not really a neighborhood. It was Brenda Whitmore's personal kingdom, and we had just moved directly into the center of it. I have handled contracts worth millions of dollars and argued with developers who believe they could bend zoning law with enough money and patience, but nothing prepares you for the strange confidence of a homeowners association president who thinks a clipboard is the same thing as authority. After that first visit, Brenda Whitmore began appearing around our house with the consistency of a scheduled inspection. The soft crunch of gravel in our driveway would announce her arrival before I even saw the white sport utility vehicle pull up to the curb. Sometimes she walked slowly along the sidewalk measuring fence posts. Other times she stood across the street pretending to check landscaping while watching our house with the focus of someone studying a target. At first it seemed almost harmless, the kind of over-enthusiastic neighborhood management that comes with suburban life. Then the letters started. The first envelope arrived on a Monday morning tucked neatly into our mailbox between a grocery coupon and a utility bill. Official HOA letterhead printed in bright blue ink, the kind designed to look important. According to the notice, our mailbox was 2 inches closer to the street than the neighborhood guidelines allowed. 2 inches. I remember holding the paper between my fingers while the smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen and the morning news murmured quietly from the television. Emily read the letter once, then set it down calmly, and went back to packing her work bag. She had that ability to remain perfectly steady when something ridiculous happened, like a judge listening to an argument that had already lost before it began. I moved the mailbox exactly 2 inches that afternoon just to avoid the headache. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. Within 3 weeks, we had received notices about the color of our porch light, the angle of our trash can placement on collection day, and a warning that the branches of our oak tree extended 4 inches too close to the sidewalk. Every letter carried the same signature at the bottom. Brenda Whitmore, President, Redwood Creek Homeowners Association. The neighborhood itself began to feel different after that. I noticed how quiet people became when her vehicle passed down the street. Lawn mowers would suddenly stop. Conversations on front porches would fade into silence. It was the kind of tension you feel in small towns where everyone knows who holds the unofficial power. One evening while I was tightening a loose hinge on our front gate, our next-door neighbor stepped quietly across the lawn. His name was Mark Collins, a retired firefighter with a gray mustache and a voice that sounded like gravel rolling down a hill. He glanced toward the street before speaking, as if the hedges themselves might be listening. He told me Brenda had been running the Homeowners Association for 7 years, and no one ever challenged her decisions anymore. Not after the last family tried. Apparently, they spent nearly $20,000 fighting fines before finally moving away. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and gasoline from someone's leaf blower down the block while Mark talked. The sun was setting behind the houses and casting long shadows across the pavement. I remember thinking how strange it was that a place built for quiet suburban comfort could feel like a territory controlled by one person with a clipboard. And what Brenda Whitmore did not realize, what she could not possibly know while she kept measuring fence posts and mailing warnings, was that the two people she had decided to push out of Redwood Creek were not strangers to legal battles. In fact, we had spent most of our adult lives inside courtrooms much larger than the one she would eventually walk into. I remember the exact moment when Brenda Whitmore decided that polite warnings were no longer enough. It was a Saturday morning in early April, warm enough that the smell of cut grass drifted across the neighborhood, and someone 2 houses down was grilling something that smelled like smoked ribs. I was standing in the driveway rinsing dust off my pickup truck when the familiar white sport utility vehicle rolled slowly to a stop along the curb. The engine idled with a low, steady hum, while Brenda stepped out holding a thick folder under one arm. She walked toward me with that same rehearsed smile, the one that looked friendly until you noticed the calculation behind it. Without even saying hello, she opened the folder and handed me a stack of printed documents. The paper felt heavy in my hands, fresh from a laser printer, and clipped together with a bright red binder clip like it belonged in a law office. According to the letter, the Homeowners Association had officially determined that our property had accumulated multiple violations over the previous 60 days. Mailbox placement, landscaping compliance, exterior lighting standards, trash container visibility. Each item carried a separate fine, and when I flipped to the final page, I saw the number printed at the bottom in bold type. $7,400. The sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street faded into the background while I stared at the page. Brenda folded her arms and watched my reaction the way a referee watches a scoreboard. She explained in a calm, almost cheerful voice that if the balance was not paid within 30 days, the Homeowners Association would begin legal enforcement procedures, which could eventually include a lien against the property. Emily stepped out onto the porch just then, the screen door clicking softly behind her. She walked down the steps and asked politely if there had been some mistake. Brenda's smile widened slightly, but the tone of her voice changed. She spoke slowly, as if explaining something to people she believed were incapable of understanding the rules of her neighborhood. She said Redwood Creek had standards, and that homeowners who could not meet those standards often discovered they had purchased houses in the wrong community. I remember the faint rustle of oak leaves overhead and the distant bark of a dog, while Emily listened quietly. She asked to review the documentation and calmly pointed out that several of the violations referenced guidelines that had been amended 2 years earlier. Brenda dismissed the observation immediately. She said the board had already reviewed everything and the decision was final. Then she added something that told me this was never about mailboxes or porch lights. She said the association would also be pursuing additional enforcement for what she described as disruptive behavior, because we had questioned HOA authority in writing. I felt the old familiar shift in my mind that happens right before a legal fight begins, the same sensation I get when reading the opening lines of a lawsuit that has been carefully designed to intimidate rather than prove anything. Brenda turned back toward her vehicle, clearly satisfied that the message had been delivered. Before she opened the door, she looked over her shoulder and reminded us that the association had already scheduled a formal court hearing to enforce the penalties. The words hung in the warm air while the sun reflected off her windshield. What she believed was the final step in removing us from Redwood Creek was actually the moment she had unknowingly set the stage for a courtroom she would never control. I have spent enough years inside legal offices to recognize when someone is not just filing a complaint, but staging a performance. Brenda Whitmore was not interested in resolving a dispute about mailbox placement or porch lighting. She wanted a public demonstration of authority. That realization became clear the moment the official notice for the hearing arrived. The envelope was thicker than the earlier letters, stamped with the seal of the county civil court, and addressed in formal block lettering that made it look far more serious than it actually was. When I opened it at the kitchen table that evening, the smell of roasted coffee beans from the grinder filled the room, while Emily leaned against the counter reading over my shoulder. According to the filing, the Redwood Creek Homeowners Association was requesting judicial enforcement of multiple fines and penalties totaling more than $10,000 after additional administrative fees had been added. The language was dramatic, almost theatrical, describing repeated violations, refusal to comply, and alleged disruption of community standards. I could practically hear Brenda's voice behind every sentence. Outside our kitchen window, the streetlights had just flickered on, and the soft buzz of summer insects drifted through the warm evening air. Emily read the document slowly, and then gave a small, thoughtful nod. She pointed out 3 separate procedural errors on the second page before I even reached the final paragraph. One of the cited regulations had expired the previous year. Another referenced a section of the HOA bylaws that had been removed during a board revision 5 years earlier. And the filing itself had been submitted through a private legal service rather than through the Homeowners Association's registered counsel. It was the legal equivalent of building a house on a foundation made of cardboard. But what interested Emily more was the hearing itself. Brenda had requested that the matter be handled in open civil court rather than through the normal arbitration channel most associations used. That meant she wanted a room full of people watching when the decision was announced. The next morning, we drove downtown to the courthouse to review the official docket. The building stood 6 stories tall with wide stone steps leading to heavy glass doors that reflected the bright Texas sky. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, while security officers directed visitors through metal detectors. We walked past rows of wooden benches and bulletin boards covered with printed schedules until we reached the civil filings desk. The clerk located the case within seconds and slid a copy of the hearing notice across the counter. The date printed at the top was only 2 weeks away. Brenda Whitmore versus Daniel Harper and Emily Harper. I could almost picture Brenda practicing her speech in front of a mirror somewhere, imagining the moment she would stand in front of a judge and prove to the entire neighborhood that her authority could not be questioned. What she did not know, what she could not possibly know when she chose that courtroom, was that Emily had quietly recognized something the moment she saw the docket number. And the small calm smile that appeared on her face as we walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight told me the stage Brenda had chosen was about to become a place she would deeply regret. I noticed the change in Emily the moment we stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon. It was subtle, the kind of shift only someone who has spent years beside her would recognize. The warm Texas sunlight bounced off the rows of parked cars while a breeze carried the distant smell of street food from a vendor somewhere around the corner. Emily paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps and looked back at the tall stone building with the quiet focus she usually reserved for complicated legal puzzles. Most people would have felt nervous after receiving a court notice like the one Brenda had filed. Emily looked almost amused. I asked her what she had noticed when she saw the docket number inside the clerk's office. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked across the sidewalk toward the parking lot, the steady click of her shoes against the concrete echoing softly between the buildings. Finally, she said something that made the entire situation feel very different. The hearing had been assigned to courtroom 4B on the 3rd floor. That detail alone might not sound important to anyone else, but Emily knew the courthouse layout better than most attorneys who practiced there every week. Courtroom 4B was normally used for overflow civil hearings when the primary docket rooms were full. The judge assigned to that room rotated depending on the weekly schedule. Emily explained this calmly while unlocking the passenger door of our truck. The important part was the date printed on the hearing notice. The hearing had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning 2 weeks away. That happened to be the exact day the court calendar rotated assignments for visiting federal judges reviewing state-level disputes that involved potential property law conflicts. I leaned against the door frame while she spoke, listening to the quiet rumble of traffic moving through downtown Austin. The pieces were beginning to line up in a way Brenda Whitmore could never have predicted. Emily did not sound excited when she explained it. She sounded thoughtful, like a chess player watching an opponent move a piece into the wrong position. She told me that the docket clerk had likely assigned the hearing automatically based on case availability without realizing the larger implication. Brenda had requested a public court session because she wanted the room full of people when the association demanded payment. What Brenda did not understand was that open court meant the case would follow the official judicial rotation schedule rather than a private arbitration panel. That meant the presiding authority would be whoever was assigned to the courtroom that morning. Emily slid into the passenger seat and closed the door with a quiet click. I sat behind the steering wheel watching a city bus roll past the courthouse entrance while the weight of her explanation settled in my mind. Brenda had spent months building her case, mailing letters, issuing fines, and planning a dramatic courtroom victory that she expected the neighborhood to hear about for years. She had carefully chosen the stage for that moment. But the one thing she never bothered to check was who would actually be sitting in the judge's chair when the hearing began. And judging by the calm expression on Emily's face as we drove out of the parking lot, I had the feeling Brenda Whitmore was about to discover that the courtroom she picked was not the one she thought she controlled. I have seen people walk into courtrooms with confidence before, but Brenda Whitmore carried herself with something stronger than confidence that morning. It was the certainty of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The hallway outside courtroom 4B smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet, while the echo of footsteps bounced along the marble floor. Lawyers moved past carrying folders. Clerks pushed carts stacked with files, and somewhere down the corridor a copier hummed steadily like a distant engine. Brenda arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled hearing, wearing the same cream-colored blazer I remembered from the earlier meetings in the neighborhood. She stood near the courtroom doors, surrounded by 2 members of the Homeowners Association board who looked more nervous than she did. From across the hallway, I could hear her voice drifting through the quiet morning air as she explained to them how simple the process would be. According to Brenda, the judge would review the violations, confirm that the fines had been issued properly, and then sign an order forcing payment. She spoke with the relaxed authority of someone giving instructions to employees rather than preparing for a legal argument. A few neighbors from Redwood Creek had even shown up, standing quietly along the hallway wall like spectators waiting to see how the drama would unfold. The heavy courtroom doors opened with a low mechanical creak and the bailiff stepped out, holding a clipboard. His uniform badge reflected the fluorescent lights above as he called the next case on the schedule. Brenda straightened her shoulders and walked inside first, her heels tapping confidently against the tile floor. The courtroom itself was larger than most people expected, with long wooden benches and tall windows that allowed the morning sunlight to spill across the polished floor. The smell of varnished wood and paper files hung in the air, while the quiet rustle of people settling into their seats filled the room. I sat beside Emily at the defense table while Brenda arranged her documents across from us with deliberate precision. She did not look at us directly at first. Instead, she whispered something to her attorney, a thin man with silver-framed glasses who kept adjusting the stack of papers in front of him. The bailiff stepped to the front of the room and glanced toward the hallway, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Brenda leaned slightly toward us then, her voice low but sharp enough to carry across the table. She said that this entire situation could have been avoided if we had simply followed the community standards from the beginning. The words sounded rehearsed, almost like a line she had practiced many times. Emily listened without responding, her hands folded calmly. In front of her on the table, the room grew quiet as more people entered and filled the benches behind us. Outside the windows, the sunlight brightened the edges of the courthouse lawn, while the faint sound of traffic drifted up from the street below. Then the bailiff cleared his throat and spoke the words every courtroom visitor recognizes. All rise for the presiding judge. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as everyone stood. Brenda Whitmore stood with the same confident expression she had worn all morning, completely unaware that the next few seconds were about to change everything she believed about this case. The courtroom remained standing for a moment longer than usual, the quiet stretching across the room like a held breath. Sunlight poured through the tall windows and reflected off the polished wooden railings, filling the space with a warm glow that made the entire scene feel almost unreal. I could hear the faint rustle of paper behind us where a few Redwood Creek neighbors had taken seats along the benches, whispering softly to each other while they waited to see how this strange neighborhood dispute would end. Brenda Whitmore stood tall across the aisle with her hands resting confidently on the edge of the table, the same satisfied expression still fixed on her face. To her, this was the moment she had been preparing for. The bailiff stepped aside from the doorway, his posture straight and formal as the door behind the bench opened quietly. Every head in the courtroom turned toward that doorway. I glanced sideways at Emily for the briefest second and saw the same calm expression she had carried all morning, the kind of steady composure that comes from years of experience inside rooms exactly like this one. The footsteps behind the bench were measured and unhurried as the figure entered. The room stayed silent except for the soft movement of fabric and the faint hum of the lights above. Then the judge stepped forward into full view. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The moment hung there, suspended between confusion and recognition. Brenda Whitmore blinked once, her confident posture faltering just enough to reveal uncertainty. The judge walking toward the bench looked familiar to her, but not in the way she expected. Emily moved at the same moment the rest of the room realized what was happening. She rose from the chair beside me, the quiet scrape of wood against the floor echoing softly across the courtroom. Without a word, she walked calmly around the defense table and toward the front of the room. I could hear the small gasp from somewhere behind us as the spectators began to understand. The bailiff did not react with surprise. He simply stepped aside and gave the slight nod of acknowledgement that comes from routine familiarity. Emily reached the bench, turned, and took her seat in the judge's chair with the same composed movement she used every time she entered a courtroom in her professional capacity. The entire room froze in stunned silence. Brenda Whitmore's expression changed slowly, like someone watching the ground shift beneath their feet. The certainty that had carried her through the entire morning disappeared piece by piece. Her attorney adjusted his glasses and stared at the bench as if trying to confirm what his eyes were telling him. Emily looked out across the room for a moment before speaking, her voice calm and steady as it carried through the chamber. She welcomed everyone to the session of the court and confirmed the case listed on the docket. The sound of her voice filled the room with quiet authority, the same authority Brenda had spent months trying to challenge. For the first time since this entire situation began, Brenda Whitmore realized that the stage she had carefully chosen for her victory belonged to someone else entirely. The silence in the courtroom after Emily spoke felt heavier than anything that had happened before. Even the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, filling the space where Brenda Whitmore's confidence had been only moments earlier. I watched her standing across the aisle, the same woman who had spent months measuring mailboxes and sending violation letters, now looking like someone who had just walked into the wrong room by mistake. Her attorney shifted in his seat, slowly straightening the stack of papers in front of him, as if reorganizing them might somehow change the situation. The neighbors from Redwood Creek sitting behind us whispered softly, the sound spreading through the benches like wind moving through tall grass. Emily remained calm in the judge's chair, reviewing the case file with the steady focus that had taken her years to earn. The polished wooden gavel rested beside her hand, while sunlight from the tall windows cast long reflections across the bench. When she spoke again, her voice carried through the courtroom with the kind of authority that does not need to be raised to be heard. She confirmed the details of the filing submitted by the Redwood Creek Homeowners Association and then asked the attorney representing the association to explain the basis for the penalties being requested. The man stood slowly, adjusting his tie while glancing toward Brenda, as if hoping she might somehow rescue the argument she had created. He began outlining the alleged violations exactly as they appeared in the paperwork, referencing mailbox measurements, landscaping requirements, and community compliance standards. But the confidence he had shown earlier in the hallway was gone now. Emily listened patiently, occasionally making a small note on the file in front of her. When he finished, she asked a series of questions so precise that the entire argument began to unravel almost immediately. She asked which version of the association bylaws had been used to calculate the fines. She asked why several of the cited rules no longer appeared in the current governing documents filed with the county. She asked why the case had been submitted to open civil court rather than the mandatory arbitration process required by the association's own charter. Each question was delivered calmly, but each one revealed another weakness in the claim. The attorney's answers became slower, more uncertain, until finally he admitted that the documentation might need additional review. Brenda Whitmore sat rigid beside him, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet disbelief that spread across her face. The courtroom had grown completely still again, every person in the room realizing that the dramatic victory she had expected was dissolving in real time. Emily closed the file gently and looked out across the courtroom for a moment before delivering the decision. She explained that the association had failed to demonstrate that the fines were supported by the governing documents currently recognized by law, and that the procedural errors in the filing made the request unenforceable in its current form. The request for enforcement was dismissed. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block was not loud, but it echoed clearly through the room. Just like that, the months of letters, warnings, and threats from the self-declared ruler of Redwood Creek ended with a single calm decision from the bench. As people began to rise from the benches behind us, I glanced once more at Brenda Whitmore. For the first time since we had moved into the neighborhood, she looked small, like someone who had just discovered that authority does not come from a clipboard or a title on a homeowners association letterhead. It comes from the law itself. And that morning, the law had been sitting directly across from her the entire time.